Hey, what's going on, Strummers? Jeff from Strumwood Guitars, and here's another installment of What's in the Case. So as you know, I get a lot of work from local music stores, and a lot of times I am not part of the communication at all, and here, again, is another example of that. I was told that it was a cracked headstock because the employees were told it was a cracked headstock, and when it came to me, it actually was not your typical break. Of course, it's on your typical type of guitar. So here we have an Epiphone Riviera. It's a pretty fun one. I do enjoy doing these, so let's get into it. So of course I have removed the tuners, I've removed the nut and the strings that were kind of just holding everything together. And when I removed the duct tape that was sitting back here and the residue, it does come off nicely and in one straight cut. I would be interested to hear the story on how this one happened. That's a lot of impact to come straight down, as your traditional kind of headstock break, if that is such a thing, is going to give you a little bit more grain runout that will allow you to have something to kind of glue to, and when it's lining up on the neck, then you actually do have just a bigger surface to actually have a little bit better success there. So we're just about ready for glue. The last thing I'm going to do is kind of come in here and kind of poke at all these fibers. I do it with either a knife or a scalpel or a wire brush. And all I'm trying to do is remove anything that's going to hinder a good locking kind of mechanism, or just something that's going to prevent glue from having a nice strong setup. If you're trying to attach loose bits and pieces, meaning that a whole section of this is wiggling, you're probably better off to actually remove it and have that filled up with glue rather than having this loose piece, because you're not really getting anything to hold it all together. And when I say kind of this locking piece, I'm referring to this. So on the headstock, we have the matching kind of locking key, if you will. So this should be able to slide in under that and give us something to kind of hold this together. With this being such a straight break, we don't have a lot of long running grains, so any of these types of attachments that we can use is going to just work better for us. So this is actually pretty clean. All right, so lining this up on the angle, it comes in nicely. So there's no hindering, I'm not really forcing anything in here, and it's sitting nice and flush. Of course, we still have a lot more work to do with this, but as far as a starting point on where this is going to sit, that is nice. If you had this big gap along the finish line, you know that something is preventing the two to coming back together. So that looks good to go. So the last thing that we want to do before we add glue is just do a dry run. Now, it's always easier to do these types of things when you don't have glue kind of pouring out or the time stress of the glue setting. But what we're going to do is put the neck in place. We know that this lines up from our last step, but how are we going to clamp it if we need to kind of do any sort of special rigging? It's just much easier when you don't have glue everywhere. And another part of the dry glue up is putting things such as this wax paper, and this is just going to prevent the glue, if there's any spill out, to kind of sticking to anything that I don't want it to. And I also have some wet paper towels and so forth, just kind of ready for the cleanup, just out of frame. I'm just kind of putting the glue a little bit of everywhere. Obviously we're going to have some excessive cleanup after the next step, so I'm not terribly worried about what this looks like. And we'll do the same thing on this end. And then with all of our squeeze out, it should give us a nice kind of glue up. And I'm not going to go crazy on this end. I am obviously aware of the truss rod. I don't want to gluing too much of this up. But especially with all these little cavities and so forth, we want to make sure that we have gluing in there. And you can see right there when I added the elastic band that a little bit more glue came out. That's exactly what you're looking for. That squeeze out is telling us that it's a nice firm fit. Everything's holding together. And we're just going to leave that. We'll come back to that tomorrow. So now the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to install these maple splines into the neck. Now, of course, this is going to be a really nice hardwood that holds everything together and gives us a little bit more stability in this neck. The biggest thing that we want to watch out for is the truss rod that's running through the side, and depending on how far you're going to go back is the distance that you will have as the actual headstock itself. So there's many different jigs that you can use. Some people do this freehand, which scares me just to even think about. But for me, I have actually really enjoyed this. I got this idea from Ted Woodford, but it's just a very simple jig. It's just a piece of 1/2-inch plywood that's got cork on either side, and it's got a little spacer on the bottom that just slides over the headstock. And it has a single groove of a 1/4-inch bit. And when you put it in place and line it up accordingly, then we can just use a straight bit on our router that's going to give us a nice straight cut. And then just for added simplicity, it's just a 1/2-inch spacer block. So we put it in here, run our router across, and then we can take out the spacer block. And we already have our final depth, and we don't have to be fumbling around with any of the settings on the router or any of the clamps as we move forward. It's a great idea, and that's what we're going to do, is make a little bit of noise. Now you can see we have 2 parallel lines in the middle, and it's going to be fairly easy to get a spline to sit in there. So what we're going to do is shape this to this slot and then glue this in place. And once that sets, then we can carve this in, sand this all smooth, and then we will look at the finishing procedures. I just found that this is a little bit less tension than hammering it in. There we go. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now that I've sanded this transition with 400 grit sandpaper, it's ready for finish. You can't feel any of the lines from the paint or the wood filler. We also don't feel any of the lines of the splints, which is exactly what we're looking for, and we're ready to cover this up. Now, when I did originally sign this in from the client, I did suggest just doing like a black stinger on the back so that we don't have to deal with the metallic paint. It was approved. But in retrospect, I think that actually would have the tip of the stinger to be somewhere at about the 4th or 5th fret, which I think would stand out and look a little funny on the back, even though this would match the front of the face of the headstock. And I'm going to go a different approach this time, and I'm actually going to use some glitter paint. It's a little bit lighter than what this finish is, and it's just some Rust-Oleum, but it's very close to what this is, and I'm going to actually add some liquid stain and different things and actually see if we can get a little bit closer to this finish. I'm a little excited to try something new. I always like challenging myself, and we've already been approved to cover this up in black, so it's kind of, if it doesn't work, then we'll just paint it over with black. But let's take a stab and see if we can get a little bit closer of a finish here. Alright, so there is a couple of coats. I honestly have forgot to be filming through all of this. So the way that I got here is I did a liquid stain and shellac, and just kind of started very lightly doing a base coat on top of the splints, and then I came back with a second time, and then I added a drop of black just to give us a little bit more weight on the finish. And then I found this glitter paint, which matches very similarly to the metallic of the guitar already, and that's the state that it's in now. Surprisingly, this has worked quite well, a lot better than I thought it would be. I just wanted to try and see if I can get close to that. Again, I've already had permission to just basically make this black, but that wasn't much fun. So this is pretty close, and now I'm just going to wet sand this probably to about 800 grit and try and eliminate these lines on the paint, and then we'll be able to clear coat on top of that, and then that should give us very close to this end result. I've sprayed this with 12 coats of lacquer, so it is in the same vicinity as far as sheen compared to the rest of the guitar. And once the tuners are on here, you're not even really going to notice this line. It's much better than a kind of just a generic black stinger in my opinion, and it's just a little bit of a fun story for this guitar. So now we buff it out and get it ready to go. Now when doing wet sanding, really the trick is to keep some sort of lubricant over the finish. We don't want to be scratching all those layers of lacquer off. We actually just want it to get nice and smooth, and we don't feel any of that kind of sticky texture or any of the overspray. So really the only thing that you need is a kind of a clean, dry cloth, and that's just going to wipe us between grits, and your wet sandpaper. And then I just use, as you've seen many times before, just some water and with a couple drops of dish soap. For better results, you can actually let this stuff soak overnight, but I'm not really terribly worried about it. I just kind of leave a little bit of a pool in there and just throw it on, and it doesn't take very long before it starts moving, and you're okay to kind of get a little bit over. So I want to get the transition of where the lacquer was kind of building up and the binding, and of course in all the corners. I'm using very light, if at all, any pressure. I don't want to be scratching through this finish. I don't want to be removing anything. I'm just going for a smoother texture. Don't worry about the cloudiness at this point. That's what's going to happen as we start moving up the grits. And then you just wipe it dry with your paper towel or your rag. Make sure it's clean. At this point also, I would recommend using everything. If you're using sandpaper, a lot of people have collections. I myself have little pieces of sandpaper everywhere, but when it comes to final finish, I'm always using a new piece of sandpaper, just in case there's any sort of contaminants from the last job that you did. I don't want to be messing up my finish. So these little dots that we're seeing, these little dark spots, that's just telling me that this isn't all one same texture. And you can kind of use your judgment. We don't necessarily have to get rid of every single one of these, because as we move up the grits, these do go away. But if you have a lot of them, you're probably not quite ready to go to the next grit.
So this texture that we were removing is commonly called orange peel, and it's the lacquer gassing off, creating these little pits. But as you can see, with some more sanding, we've gotten rid of the majority of it.
So now we are at 2500 grit, and you can see the shine just as one big solid line. I can also feel it as I'm sanding. It's very, very smooth. You want to make sure that you're always keeping this wet, and if you're starting to get any sort of stickiness in these areas, then you can just wipe it dry, start over. You can try it, but this is looking very, very good. And the other thing you can notice too is that those little peaks and valleys that we're looking at have almost all disappeared.
This is my favorite part on finish repairs now. So I realize that this job is not perfect. I wasn't really expecting it to be, but considering that we just use products off of the shelf to try and match a metallic paint, I'm pretty happy with the results. As is my client. They're really happy that it didn't go with a black back of the neck, and also most importantly is that it's nice and secure. That broken headstock is not an issue anymore. So I want to thank you for watching this, and if you enjoyed this video or had any other comments, please feel free to leave them below, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, keep strumming.